March 7, 1945, 3:47 p.m., the Rhine River. An American lieutenant colonel stands at the western edge of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, staring across 1,200 feet of steel and concrete that by all logic should not exist. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from the realization of what he's looking at. Every bridge for 200 miles has been destroyed. The Rhine, Hitler's final fortress, his impassable moat, was supposed to stop the Allied advance for months. But this bridge, this single structure the Germans forgot to blow, is still standing. Damaged, yes, wired with explosives that failed to detonate, but standing. The problem is simple and impossible. The bridge is dying. German engineers designed it to last decades in peacetime. Now, after years of Allied bombing, after hasty demolition attempts that weakened every support beam, after German shells now raining down trying to finish what their own explosives couldn't, the bridge has maybe 72 hours before it collapses into the river, maybe less. But 72 hours is enough. Enough to pour an entire army across. Enough to establish a bridgehead on the eastern shore. Enough to crack open the German defensive line and race toward Berlin. The war in Europe could end months earlier. Thousands of lives could be saved, if the bridge holds. American combat engineers are already running onto the span, racing against artillery fire, racing against structural physics, racing against the clock. They know what nobody wants to say out loud. This bridge is going to kill some of them. The Germans will throw everything they have at it. The structure itself is a death trap, but they also know this is the kind of moment that appears once in a war, once in a lifetime, once in history. What you're about to hear is not a story about a bridge. It's a story about human beings asked to perform miracles under conditions designed to break them. It's about engineering pushed so far beyond its limits that enemy commanders refused to believe what their own scouts reported. It's about mud, metal, mathematics, and the thin line between victory and catastrophe. And it's about how, for 72 hours in March 1945, a few hundred exhausted men held together a structure that wanted to fall apart, while across the river, the German army watched their last defense crumble and wondered if they were fighting engineers or magicians. The true miracle wasn't that the bridge stood. The miracle was what those men endured to keep it standing. 48 hours earlier, nobody believed the Remagen Bridge would matter at all. Allied intelligence had written it off. German demolition teams were positioned at every major Rhine crossing with orders to destroy anything the Americans might use. The Wehrmacht had been retreating for months, burning bridges behind them, creating a barrier of twisted steel and empty stone pilings stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. Field Marshal Montgomery was planning an elaborate northern crossing that would take weeks of preparation, thousands of boats, smokescreens, and airborne assaults. That was the plan. That was the only plan. Then scouts from the 9th Armored Division spotted something impossible. March 7th, early afternoon, the lead units approached the hills overlooking Remagen. Through binoculars, an officer saw the Ludendorff Bridge still intact, German troops in vehicles crossing eastward in retreat. It looked surreal, like a mirage. He called it in, half expecting to be told he was seeing things, but within minutes, radios up and down the line were crackling with confirmation. The bridge was real, the bridge was standing, and from the western hills, American soldiers could see German engineers running back and forth across the span, clearly trying to wire it for demolition. This was the race. Get to the bridge before the Germans could blow it. Every second mattered. American tanks and infantry charged down the hillside toward the river, taking fire from German positions on the far shore, knowing that at any moment the entire structure could vanish in a cloud of smoke and shrapnel. Machine gun fire ripped through the air. Mortars exploded in the streets. American soldiers sprinted through the town, through gardens and alleyways, pushing toward the western bridge tower. And then they heard it. A dull, heavy thud. The bridge shook. Smoke billowed from the eastern side. The Germans had triggered the demolition charges. But the bridge didn't fall. The explosives had been old, damp, poorly placed, or sabotaged. Historians still argue which was. The blast damaged the structure, cracked support beams, sent debris into the water, but the main span held.
German engineers on the far side stared in disbelief, frantically trying to rig backup charges. American infantry saw their chance and charged onto the bridge, firing as they ran, weaving between craters and twisted metal, racing across 1,200 feet of open space, with German machine guns tearing into them from both towers.
Lieutenant Karl Timmerman led the first squad across, moving through smoke and chaos, watching soldiers beside him get hit, knowing the bridge could collapse or explode at any second. But they kept moving. They reached the eastern shore. They secured the towers. And when Timmerman radioed back that the far side was theirs, the American command realized what they had. A miracle. A disaster. An opportunity that would cost lives to exploit, but could shorten the war. Within minutes, the call went out. Get engineers to Remagen. Get them there now. Combat engineers arrived and immediately understood the problem. The bridge was a wreck. The failed demolition had shattered load-bearing beams. German artillery was already zeroing in, shells exploding in the water, on the approaches, on the bridge deck itself. The structure was swaying under the weight of tanks crossing. Cables were frayed. Wooden planking was splintered. The floor of the bridge had gaping holes. And this wasn't just about keeping a damaged bridge standing for a few hours. They needed to pour an entire mechanized army across it. Thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of men, constant traffic, 24 hours a day, for as long as it took to establish a defensible position on the eastern shore. The engineers looked at the bridge, then at each other. Someone said what they were all thinking. This thing should have collapsed already. But orders were orders. Fix it. Reinforce it. Keep it open. Do whatever it takes. So they went to work. The first enemy wasn't the Germans. It was the bridge itself. The Ludendorff had been built during World War I, a massive steel railway bridge designed to move troops and supplies across the Rhine. It was never meant to carry the weight of Sherman tanks or the constant pounding of mechanized warfare. And after the botched demolition, the structure was actively trying to tear itself apart. Engineers scrambled onto the span with cutting torches, welding equipment, and cables. Their job was to identify and shore up the most critical weak points before the whole thing came down. They worked under fire, with German shells screaming in every few minutes, exploding in the water, and sending up plumes that drenched the work crews. Every impact made the bridge shudder. Every shudder raised the question, is this the one that brings it down? The deck was the immediate crisis. The wooden planking had been shredded by the explosion and by tank treads. Holes opened up large enough to swallow a jeep. Engineers laid down new timber under fire, hammering and nailing while machine gun rounds sparked off the steel around them. They worked in shifts, rotating crews every 20 minutes because the physical and psychological strain was unbearable. One engineer described it as building a house during an earthquake while someone shoots at you. Then there was the problem of the support beams. The main trusses were cracked. X-rays would have shown fractures running through critical joints, stress points ready to fail. But there were no X-rays, no engineering lab, no time for analysis. The engineers used their hands, their eyes, their ears. They climbed into the superstructure, tapping steel with hammers, listening to the sound, feeling for vibrations that meant metal was about to give way. When they found a compromised beam, they wrapped it in cable, braced it with timber, welded on reinforcement plates, anything to buy more time. One sergeant spent 6 hours inside the bridge truss system, in near darkness, working by flashlight, reinforcing a joint that was visibly bending under load. German artillery hit the bridge twice during that span. The entire structure shook. Metal groaned. The sergeant kept working. When he finally climbed out, his hands were bleeding, his face was gray with exhaustion, and he told his commanding officer the joint would hold for maybe another day. Maybe. But the bridge wasn't just breaking from damage, it was breaking from use. Every vehicle that crossed added stress. Every tank, 30 tons of steel rolling across a structure already on the verge of collapse, made the situation worse. Engineers calculated that the bridge could theoretically handle a few dozen tank crossings before failure. By the end of the first day, over 300 tanks had crossed. The math didn't work. The bridge should have fallen. But it hadn't. Not yet. The engineers started spacing out traffic, limiting the number of vehicles on the span at any given time, calculating weight distribution on the fly. They posted spotters at both ends, watching for signs of imminent collapse, unusual sway, sagging cables, popping rivets. When a support cable snapped, and they did regularly, crews rushed to replace it while traffic was temporarily halted. Soldiers waiting to cross watched engineers dangling from the superstructure, working with frozen hands and sub-freezing temperatures, and wondered how long their luck could hold.
The weather became another enemy. Rain turned to sleet. The river, swollen with spring melt, churned below, fast and cold enough to kill anyone who fell in within minutes. The surface of the bridge became slick. Vehicles skidded. Engineers working on the deck had to tie themselves to the structure to avoid being blown off by wind gusts. Hands went numb. Tools slipped. Frostbite became routine. One private, tasked with replacing a section of decking, lost feeling in his fingers after 2 hours of work. He kept going, gripping nails with his teeth, hammering by muscle memory. When he finally rotated off shift, medics had to pry the hammer from his hand. He was back on the bridge 4 hours later. And through it all, the German artillery kept coming. Every few minutes, shells would scream in. Sometimes they hit the water, sending up geysers. Sometimes they hit the western approach, cratering the road, forcing engineers to fill holes and relay gravel under fire. And sometimes they hit the bridge itself. Direct hits punched through the deck, severed cables, killed soldiers. The engineers learned to recognize the sound of incoming rounds, to drop flat, to wait for the explosion, then get back up and keep working. There was no other choice. Stop working, and the bridge falls. Keep working, and you might die. But stopping meant certain failure. Working meant a chance. So they worked. But the human cost was mounting in ways that didn't show up in casualty reports. These weren't just engineers. They were kids, 19, 20, 22 years old. Boys from farms and factories, trained for a few months in basic construction and battlefield repair, now tasked with holding together a structure that defied every principle they'd been taught. And they were breaking. Sleep became a luxury no one could afford. Engineers worked in 4-hour shifts, but those off-shift couldn't really rest. The noise was constant. Artillery, aircraft, vehicles crossing, metal grinding against metal. Men collapsed where they stood, woke up 20 minutes later, and went back to work. One lieutenant stopped bothering to take off his boots. He knew he'd just have to put them back on. Fear became routine. The first time German shells hit close, everyone dove for cover, hearts pounding. By the third day, men barely flinched. It wasn't bravery, it was exhaustion. The body and mind simply ran out of adrenaline. Fear became a background hum, always there, no longer sharp enough to distract from the work. Some men found ways to cope: humor, dark and bitter, rituals. One crew painted a running tally on a support beam. Every hour the bridge stayed up, they added a mark. It became a superstition. As long as they kept marking time, the bridge would hold. Another group started a betting pool. How many more days before total collapse? The smart money was on 36 hours. They were already past 48. But some men couldn't cope. A young engineer, tasked with crawling into a damaged section of the truss to inspect a critical joint, froze halfway in. He couldn't move forward, couldn't move back, just locked up, staring at the cracked steel inches from his face, understanding that if it gave way, he'd be crushed instantly. It took 2 soldiers in 20 minutes of coaxing to get him out. He sat on the bank afterward, shaking, unable to speak. They gave him coffee and a blanket, and he stared at the bridge like it was a living thing, trying to kill him, which in a sense, it was. Letters home became impossible. What do you say? I'm fine working on a bridge that's about to collapse while the Germans try to blow me up? Some men stopped writing. Others wrote letters they never intended to send. Goodbye letters, tucked into pockets alongside dog tags, just in case. One sergeant kept a diary, short entries, scribbled during breaks. March 8th, bridge still up, don't know how. March 9th, lost 2 men today, structure worse, still working. March 10th, can't feel my hands, can't think straight, bridge still up. And then there were moments of unexpected beauty, small breaks in the horror that reminded them they were still human. A moment when the artillery stopped for 20 minutes and the only sound was the river below.
A moment when someone shared a chocolate bar scrounged from a ration pack, and 5 men huddled in the cold, savoring it. A moment when the sun broke through the clouds just for a few seconds, and the entire bridge was lit gold, and it didn't look like a death trap. It looked like a miracle. But those moments passed quickly. The work continued, the bridge kept dying, and the engineers kept fighting to keep it alive. Across the river, the German command was spiraling into panic and disbelief. In bunkers and command posts, miles from Remagen, Wehrmacht officers stared at reconnaissance reports and refused to believe what they were reading. The bridge should have been destroyed. Their engineers had wired it. The explosives had detonated. How was it still standing?
Initial reports from the front were dismissed as errors. The Americans couldn't possibly be crossing at Remagen. The bridge was gone. It had to be. But then more reports came in, an aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted radio chatter. The Americans weren't just crossing, they were pouring across. Thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, and the bridge was still there. For the German High Command, this was a strategic catastrophe. The Rhine was supposed to be the line where the Americans stalled, where exhausted divisions regrouped, where the war slowed down long enough for Germany to negotiate something better than total annihilation. With the Rhine breached, that hope evaporated. Allied armies could drive deep into Germany, cut off entire Wehrmacht units, collapse the Western Front. But beyond strategy, there was something psychological happening. Something worse than losing a bridge. The Germans were losing faith in their own defensive calculations, in their engineering, in the idea that nature and physics were on their side. If the Americans could cross the Rhine at Remagen, what else could they do? What other assumptions were wrong? German soldiers near the bridge had whispered that the Americans had brought in some kind of new technology, some advanced engineering the Wehrmacht didn't understand. Rumors spread. The bridge was being held up by invisible cables, by concrete poured underwater overnight, by some miracle of American industry. The truth that exhausted combat engineers were literally holding it together with wire and willpower was somehow harder to believe than magic. German engineers were ordered to destroy the bridge at all costs. Artillery batteries repositioned. Luftwaffe pilots were pulled from other fronts and sent on suicide missions to bomb the span. V-2 rockets, Germany's wonder weapon, were retargeted toward Remagen. Frogmen were sent down the river at night with explosive charges, trying to plant them on the bridge's underwater supports. But nothing worked. Artillery hit the bridge over and over, but the American engineers kept repairing it. Luftwaffe planes screamed in low, dropping bombs, but anti-aircraft fire was so intense that most were shot down before they could line up a run. The ones that got through scored near misses, close enough to drench the engineers, not close enough to collapse the structure. V-2 rockets, notoriously inaccurate, landed in fields and towns miles away. The frogmen were spotted by American sentries and killed or driven off before they could set charges. To the Germans, it felt like fighting against fate itself. One Wehrmacht officer captured days later said the Americans must have made a deal with the devil. He said, "We threw everything at that bridge. Everything. And it stood. How do you fight that?" Morale among German units near Remagen collapsed. If they couldn't destroy a single damaged bridge, how could they stop the entire American army? Desertions increased. Units retreated without orders. The psychological impact of the bridge spread far beyond the bridgehead itself. It became a symbol of German impotence, of the inevitability of defeat. And every hour the bridge stood, the American buildup grew stronger. More men, more tanks, more artillery. The bridge had expanded east, pushing German forces back, establishing a perimeter that became harder to dislodge with each passing hour. The Germans had lost the race. They just didn't know how to stop running. But on the bridge itself, time was running out. By March 10th, 72 hours after capture, the engineers knew they were living on borrowed time.
The structure was failing in slow motion. Rivets popped loose and fell into the river. Support beams sagged visibly. Cables stretched and frayed. The bridge wasn't just damaged, it was dying, and everyone could feel it. American command made the decision to begin construction of a pontoon bridge alongside the Ludendorff. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The railroad bridge couldn't last. But the pontoon bridge would take time to complete, and until then, everything depended on keeping the Ludendorff operational. Engineers worked around the clock, no longer trying to repair, just trying to delay the inevitable. They braced failing joints with timber. They rerouted traffic to avoid the weakest sections. They stood on the deck, feeling every vibration, every shift, waiting for the moment when the math finally caught up and the whole thing came apart. Soldiers crossing the bridge felt it too. The structure swayed under the weight of tanks. You could see it moving, feel it in your stomach like being on a ship in heavy seas. Some men ran across, sprinting, unwilling to trust their weight to the span for a second longer than necessary. Others moved slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might be the thing that finally triggered collapse.
German artillery intensified. They knew the bridge was failing. They could see it. One more good hit might be enough. Shells came in constantly, day and night. Direct hits were rare but catastrophic. A single shell severed a major support cable, and the entire southern side of the bridge dropped 6 inches in an instant. Engineers swarmed the site, jacking the structure back up, installing emergency supports, working while vehicles continued to cross overhead. It was insane. It was suicide. It was the only option. And then, on the afternoon of March 10th, something changed. An engineer working inside the truss system heard a sound he'd been dreading for 3 days, a deep, groaning crack. Not the sharp pop of a rivet failing, but something structural, something fundamental. He scrambled out, yelling for everyone to get off the bridge, now. Traffic was halted. Engineers ran to the center span, trying to locate the source of the sound. They found it quickly. A primary support beam, one of the main load-bearing members, had developed a massive crack. It was still holding, but barely, and there was no way to repair it, no way to replace it. All they could do was reinforce the surrounding structure and hope it was enough. Word spread quickly. The bridge was on the verge of total collapse. Hours, maybe less. But orders came down from command. Keep it open. The pontoon bridges weren't ready yet. They needed more time, just a few more hours. So the engineers went back to work. They wrapped the cracked beam in every piece of cable and steel they could find. They built a scaffold under it, taking the weight off the damaged section. They did everything possible and impossible to keep that beam from failing. And they succeeded, for 16 more hours. March 11th, 3 p.m., the beam finally gave way. The crack propagated in an instant, tearing through steel, and the entire center section of the bridge dropped. Not all at once, not catastrophically, but enough. The decks sagged. Cables snapped with sounds like rifle shots. Soldiers on the western shore watched the bridge ripple like a wave moving through solid steel and braced for the entire structure to pancake into the river. It didn't. Not yet. But it was close enough that engineers were pulled off. Traffic was stopped. The bridge was officially declared unsafe. After 72 hours, the miracle was over. Except for one final job. 28 engineers were still on the bridge, trapped on unstable sections, trying to get to safety. The structure was twisting now, metal grinding against metal, supports failing one by one. The engineers had to move carefully, testing every step, avoiding sections that could give way at any moment. Other soldiers watched from the shore, helpless, as the men picked their way across a bridge that was actively collapsing. It took 40 minutes to evacuate the last engineer. He stepped off the western edge at 4:37 p.m., exactly 72 hours after the bridge had been captured. He turned to look back. At 4 p.m., with a sound like thunder, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the Rhine. The final casualty count was staggering. 28 American engineers were killed on the bridge during those 72 hours. Dozens more were wounded.
And when the bridge finally fell, it crushed several engineers who had stayed on the span too long, trying to salvage equipment, refusing to believe it was truly over. But the strategic impact was undeniable. In 72 hours, over 25,000 troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, enough men and material to establish a bridgehead that the Germans could never eliminate. By the time the Ludendorff collapsed, pontoon bridges were nearly complete. The crossing continued without interruption. The Remagen bridgehead became the launching point for Allied drives into the heart of Germany. Wehrmacht forces, already overstretched and undersupplied, couldn't contain the breakthrough. Entire divisions were cut off and surrendered. German command structures fractured. The psychological blow, losing the Rhine, losing the bridge, losing the illusion of an impenetrable defense, accelerated the collapse of German morale. Historians estimate the Remagen Bridge shortened the war in Europe by weeks, possibly months. Tens of thousands of lives, maybe more, were saved because a small group of engineers refused to let a dying bridge fall. But the cost haunted the survivors. One engineer interviewed decades later said he still heard the sound of the bridge collapsing in his nightmares. He said, "We knew it was going to fall. We knew some of us wouldn't make it off. But we stayed anyway, because that's what you do. You finish the job." Another, asked if he considered himself a hero, shook his head. "Heroes do one brave thing and it's over. We just kept working, hour after hour, scared out of our minds. That's not heroism. That's just refusal to quit." The Remagen Bridge was never rebuilt. The towers still stand on both sides of the Rhine, empty and silent, monuments to the men who died there. There's a small museum now, near the Western Tower, with photos and artifacts, rusted cable, a crushed helmet, a diary with those short, desperate entries. People visit, read the plaques, look at the river, and try to imagine what it was like. 72 hours, a bridge held together by will and wire, an enemy army collapsing in disbelief, engineers working through exhaustion and fear and artillery fire because the alternative was failure, and failure was unthinkable. But you can't really imagine it. Not unless you stood on a structure you know is about to kill you and decided to stay anyway. Not unless you've calculated the odds and understand they're impossible and done the job anyway. Not unless you felt the weight of history pressing down and chosen to hold it up just a little longer, just long enough to change the outcome. That's what happened at Remagen. Not a miracle of engineering, a miracle of human endurance, of ordinary men asked to do the impossible and somehow, against every law of physics and war and common sense, succeeding. The bridge fell, but the engineers held. And that made all the difference.